Hi, I'm Jane Albright. I'm the president of the International Wizard of Oz Club, but today I'm here as the author of one of the short stories we published in Oziana. This appeared in Oziana 19, although I actually started writing it clear back in 2012. I wanted to do something as a tribute to the Patchwork Girl, my favorite character when I'm forced to choose, clear back in 2013, and this story was what came out of that. However, it took a while before I finished and it got to Oziana. And yes, I'm a patron member. So I get the fancy schmancy hardcover signed by the contributors copies of Oziana from the club. My friend Steve Smith illustrated this story. And I guess with that said, I'll just start reading. Bitsy, the Patchwork Cat of Oz. I am not too dignified, protested Dorothy a bit crossly, as she stepped out on the tree's sturdy branch. She reached for a handhold as she sat down. I just have to be more careful than you because I can get hurt. In response, Scraps, who was dangling from her knees on that same branch, began to swing back and forth. Her braids and skirts flew wildly to the rhythm of her rhyme. A day with me spent high in a tree is much more fun than cookies and tea, she sang. It's not as if I spend all my time in the castle wearing fancy dresses, Dorothy said, clearly defending herself. Just last week, the wizard and I went with the Munchkins who take care of my old Kansas house. Now that it's a historic site, Dorothy stopped mid-sentence. Why, Scraps, she cried, reaching out to grasp her friend by the leg. What's happened to you? The Patchwork Girl neither knew nor cared what caused Dorothy's alarm. She chose to fling herself from the tree, landing in a colorful pile of quilt on the green grass far below. One shoe landed in a bush from the fall. She hopped about hunting for it as Dorothy made a hasty descent. Where are you, Shoe? Called Scraps, diving under branches and leaves as her stocking foot wiggled in the air. Stop it, Scraps, this is serious, said Dorothy, grabbing her friend's hem and giving a firm pull. Your leg has a big gash and your stuffing's all falling out. Let me look. Soon the two were inside where the Patchwork Girl sat sulking. Dorothy, Jellia Jam, and a third woman Scraps didn't know made a long inventory of all of her tears and worn spots. Dorothy and Jellia were doing all the talking. This new woman, a Winky named Hitta, expertly managed a dozen straight pins with her lips and fingers, for it was she who was to do the mending. There's always been someone about who is handy with a needle, explained Jellia with a touch of anxiety in her voice. We just cut a new patch the same size and stitch it right over the hole, or tighten seams that ripped open. Miss Dorothy, you must understand this is nothing new. Scraps is always getting caught and tearing herself on something. Surely you've noticed that what was yellow or blue one week is sometimes green or red the next. At this, Hitta decided to speak up. She hadn't been called upon for palace mending until recently, but she knew her expertise would be respected. Using Scraps' damaged knee as a convenient pincushion, she freed herself of the pins to make a point that needed to be made. Begging your pardon, but that just won't work this time. Some of these places, elbows, knees, the seam around her waist, she said, pointing to them with authority, these are already 6 and 8 patches deep from all that past patching over patches. With every one of them torn clear through. To do this job right, I need to remove all of those torn layers down to the original patch, replace it with a good sturdy fabric after adding new stuffing to make up for what's gotten lost or dirty, and sew it down with a double seam that will last. When could you start? Asked Dorothy. How long will it take? Jellia wanted to know. It'll take 2 or 3 days, but I can be here with a good supply of patching fabric tomorrow, she replied, as long as you don't mind my bringing my daughter with me. She's just a little thing and I can't leave her alone. But that won't do at all, interrupted Scraps in protest. I can't spend hours and hours getting mended and sewn. I'm too busy. I can't sit here getting stitched up all day. The little group had to agree that Scraps would not be content with the lengthy process. They outlined a plan wherein Hitta would spend 2 hours each morning and 2 more late in the afternoon sewing with Scraps, returning home each evening to her waiting family. If all went well, the Patchwork Girl would be as good as new inside a week. And so it was that young Catherine arrived at Ozma's palace the next morning. In one hand, she clutched the paper and pencil with which she was learning to write her letters. Her other hand clutched her mama's skirts. Although she'd been to the palace for festive occasions, this was the first time she'd ever seen the Patchwork Girl up close. She didn't know quite what to make of her. Scraps was equally curious, She leaned over quite low to meet Catherine face to face, one glove presented for shaking. Catherine's round blue eyes grew big as she peered into the suspender button eyes of Scraps. The soft hand reminded her of the scarecrow who'd come to visit her father a time or two. I shall call you Cat, announced the Patchwork Girl with a delighted grin. It's much easier to rhyme. Pleased with herself, she promptly turned a cartwheel, revealing quite a few rips and tears in one quick move. Modesty had never meant much to the Patchwork Girl, and she wasn't about to change that now. The sewing progressed nicely, and each 2-hour session flew by. Cat practiced her letters, Scraps taught her silly rhymes, Hida tied knots, snipped threads, and chattered away, updating those who stopped by the little sewing room to check on their progress. The Patchwork Girl was a great favorite in Ozma's court, and curiosity about her delicate condition caused many a knock at the door. As the time passed, Hedda realized there were faded patches that needed replacing too, and she found no small number of stains that stubbornly defied cleaning. Scraps was pleased to find that she didn't just sit still. She stood on her head, she laid on her tummy, and at one point even held her own head in her hands while Hedda showed her shoulder seams and Cat tied new ribbons in her hair. That was a sight that startled Dorothy considerably when she stuck her own curious head into the room. Ozma and Dorothy were walking in the palace garden. That's the tree we were climbing when I saw the stuffing coming out of Scraps, explained Dorothy, pointing at a strong oak. A good tree for climbing, said Ozma. I've climbed it a time or two myself. It's a good thing you were with her, or we might not have realized Scraps was getting so worn out. She's been leading me off to do all kinds of things, confided Dorothy. She thinks I spend too much time being a princess and not enough time having fun. We've been sledding and rock hunting. Last week we helped paint a mural. You should talk to the wizard, said Ozma thoughtfully. He's going to be updating the map of Oz next month and hasn't yet asked anyone to go with him. He's traveling by balloon, and I'm sure you and Scraps would have fun on that adventure. The thought of sailing high over Oz on a long journey did sound fun. The two girls discussed the possibilities and a plan began to form. Dorothy had become quite good with her sketching and paints. She could easily draw the landmarks below as the wizard guided the balloon through the sky. Although the Patchwork Girl wasn't terribly reliable, it was often useful to have someone along an adventure who had boundless energy and didn't need sleep. We could call her my ambassador for the journey, suggested Ozma. Whenever you choose to stop along the way, Scraps can explain your mission in her own inimitable way, inimitable style. Sorry, you'd think I'd read my own words better. The pair smiled at the thought and turned their steps to the wizard's workshop. On the fourth day, when the sewing room walls were covered with Cat's alphabets and charming little sketches, and the floor was covered with a layer of old patches, Cat had an idea. She gathered up all the patches into a heap and used her mama's scissors to snip out the good parts that were not yet worn clear through. Slowly, her supply of small patches began to grow. Once she had a basket full of them, she appealed to her mother to make her a little quilt for her dolls. There was certainly enough fabric and time to fill during the hours that passed when Scraps wasn't with them. Hida, who didn't like to be idle, thought that was a splendid idea. After 2 days of sewing the little bits together, an even more pleasing idea struck her. Why not make my little Catherine a toy animal from these scraps, she thought. There are plenty of fabric bits here, and with a little stuffed toy of her own, she'll always remember our week at Ozma's castle. Settling on the shape of a cat, in honor of Scraps' pet name for Catherine, she began to work the patches and cotton batting into a soft, four-legged shape. In no time at all, Catherine noticed. Is that a toy for me, Mama? She asked. Yes, came the reply. Did you know the very first toy Santa made was a cat? No. I must read you that story then. But not now. First, we must finish this little kitty for you. Hida had always been fond of cats, but they made her husband sneeze, so she learned to be content with loving the cats of others. She'd put saucers of milk out when wandering cats found their way to her home and have long visits with friends whose cats would jump into her lap to be petted. She knew just what proportions were right for body, legs, head, and tail, and Catherine was worried about the details. She should have claws, Mama, because you say it's not kind to have a cat that can't climb. This was true, and she was glad Catherine had learned it, but how could she fashion toy claws for a toy cat? Then she had an idea. That night, she pulled an old shoebox from a high closet shelf at home. Years ago, she had kept a pair of fancy shoes that had been covered with sequins and jeweled bows in this same box. The shoes were long gone, but she still used that box to hold bits of lace. Every time she pulled it down to get lace for a collar, she'd see a number of loose sequins scattered about in the bottom that had fallen from the shoes. They were hard and round. With a little effort, she broke 10 of them in half, tucked them safely in an envelope, and placed it in her sewing kit. The next day in the palace sewing room, while Catherine ran off for a glass of juice, Hida pulled out the 20 half sequins. Using her needle, and with considerable biting of her bottom lip, she managed to work a hole into one end of each sharp bit. Pinching a crease into the fabric paws, a quick stitch held each claw in place, much like a real cat's paw. It had worked. Her daughter would be pleased. Later that morning, after Scraps had come and gone from her patching lesson, Hida pulled the patchwork cat from her sewing basket and showed it to Catherine. Her excitement grew. Together, they decided how to pinch and gather the fabric to create ears and a face. Some filament thread intended for upholstery served as whiskers, a bit of pink velvet for a tongue, and Catherine insisted that only button eyes would do. My eyes are just like yours, she explained to her mother. My patchwork cat should have the same eyes as the patchwork girl because she's made from her scraps. A search through the sewing box produced 2 shoe buttons. With a few stitches and snips of the thread, the new toy was pronounced finished by Hida and perfect by Catherine. She declared her new toy's name would be Bitsy and placed her prominently on the sunny windowsill where the warm breeze brought with it the fragrance of Ozma's colorful garden. It was now the last day that Hida would be needed to do any mending on her celebrity client. The patchwork girl was late and Hida grew impatient. To pass the time, Catherine drew a little crayon picture of Betsy to give Scraps as a goodbye present. Do you think she'll like it, Mama? Asked the child, showing it to Hida. The likeness, which was about the size of a playing card, was quite good. The colors were in the right places. From the tiny red claws to the little black button eyes, it was the image of Betsy. Of course she will. At last, the patchwork girl arrived and submitted to her final session of repair. Hida was working on her hem when Cat presented her drawing. It's beautiful, cried Scraps, her face swept up in a pearly grin. She pulled Cat into her lap with a huge, soft hug. It's too big for a locket, but if I had a pocket, I'd always keep it with me. A pocket was actually a rather good idea. Hida looked at Scraps over from head to toe as she finished her ragged hem. You could have a pocket. Have you not had one before? We could put pockets in either seam of your skirt. You could put a patch pocket anywhere, Mama, added Cat, her hands sliding in one of her own little patch pockets to demonstrate. Oh, please do, said Scraps, pointing to her chest. Put a big patch pocket right here for Cat's picture. The job was quickly done. The pocket blended perfectly into Scraps' many patches and made a cozy little spot to tuck the drawing of Bitsy. That's the last stitch for me, said Hida with a smile, but you can always find me if you get a fresh stamp. Mother and daughter rounded up their supplies, goodbyes were said, a grateful Ozma called for the sawhorse to carry them home in style, and when it was time to part, hugging Bitsy tightly with one arm to help ward off tears, Cat headed for home with her mother. A few days later, the Scarecrow rounded a corner and found the Patchwork Girl attempting to pack heaps of little round things into a bag, a job for which her soft fingers were quite unsuited. What are you doing? Asked the curious Scarecrow. I'm off on a ballooning adventure with the Wizard and Dorothy. As we fly far and wide, I wanted to toss candy to children who see us. But candy's bad for teeth, so the wizard made me these. They're called wooden nickels. He used to throw them from his balloon in fairs before he came to Oz. Why is your picture on it? He asked. Because I am an ambassador of Oz, replied Scraps, who was so proud to say it aloud that she flung her arms wide with an elaborate flourish, throwing back her shoulders before dropping to the floor in a curtsy. Ever willing to help a friend, the Scarecrow plopped cheerfully down beside Scraps and began bagging up the wooden nickels, though what anyone might do with a wooden nickel was a question even the Scarecrow's fine brain could not answer. As the day of the balloon departure approached, Ozma and Dorothy paid a visit to the wizard. I'm worried about Scraps, said the ruler as soon as his door was opened. I thought she'd been repaired, said the wizard in surprise. I understood she's as good as new. She is, but she isn't, explained Dorothy. She seems, well, tired. Yesterday, I found her just sitting, looking out a window. She'd been there for half an hour. And I've noticed she hardly ever speaks in rhyme, added Ozma. The wizard's expression was worried. He pulled them both inside, shut the door, and turned to his bookshelf. I wonder what might happen when so many of her patches were replaced, he said, pulling several thick volumes from the shelf. The pattern of life was shaken over her, if I remember correctly. He flipped open the Patchwork Girl of Oz and turned to the end of chapter 4. Here it is, he added. then read to them aloud how the powder of life had first fallen on her head and arms as Scraps was brought to life. Her magic wasn't working from the inside out. Removing so much of her original fabric has simply weakened her. But it's nothing we can't fix. Help me look through these other books, my dears. I'm sure we'll find a way to get her as lively as ever. And so the three put their heads together over the wizard's collection of wizardry books and began the search for an enchantment that torn patches could not destroy. You rang? Asked the Patchwork Girl later that day as she responded to word that the wizard wanted her. Something about the trip? She asked. No, Scraps, replied Ozma in her official voice. This is about you. We've noticed you've lost a bit of your energy since Hida did her mending, and the wizard found a way to ensure your new patches are every bit as enchanted as your old ones. Please sit right here and do what he tells you. Although he'd been warned, the wizard was taken aback by the calm obedience that met this request. He got quickly to business. Dr. Pip's powder of life not being available, and wishing pills ill-suited for Scraps' lack of ingestion, the wizard set about using a reanimation enchantment recorded in one of his many magic books. He adapted the words a bit to make it specific to the Patchwork Girl. Then, before the interested audience of Ozma and Dorothy, he began. First, there was incense to burn, candles to light, and a length of white fabric dramatically thrown over the Patchwork Girl. Do you think all this is necessary? Whispered Dorothy to Ozma. The wizard looked pointedly in their direction. Silence returned, and he continued. With many pointing gestures tied to each word, the wizard circled his subject, saying, inside, outside, tail to head, cotton patches, stitches, thread, nose and toes and braided hair, pearly teeth and fabrics rare, every corner seam and hem, reds and blues from eyes to shoes, I now command each bit of you to spring to life as good as new. With one last flourish, he pulled the fabric away. The Patchwork Girl leapt up from her seat and danced a jig on the spot. And at that moment, far away in the Winky country, a startled Bitsy snapped to life too. She stretched and twisted a bit, feeling each of her cotton muscles in sequence, then leapt down from Catherine's bed where the child had left her and jumped up to the open window. Blinking at the sunshine, she looked back into the shadows of the room before calmly dropping down on the grass. Hida was pinning laundry to the line when she heard an unfamiliar voice say hello. She turned, but no one was there. Puzzled, she reached down to the basket at her feet for a pillowcase to find Bitsy beside it. Assuming Catherine had dropped her there, she reached for her instead, only to see Bitsy jump back and bat her hand with her own stuffed paw. Never was a mother more astonished. It was the picture that had done it, of course, though it would be some time before anyone understood. The wizard's charm was so thorough that it had enchanted the lightness of Bitsy, tucked into Scrap's pocket, and brought the toy cat to life. A new balloon had been created for the mapping mission. Each of its four sides represented a different country in Oz, with green at the top for the Emerald City. Green and gold Oz pendants were secured to it all around, and a roomy basket was outfitted quite comfortably with provisions enough to see them for several days at a time. It was simply accepted that they'd easily restock their supplies whenever they chose to descend. There was a high stool beside a flat drawing surface that protruded around the top edge of the basket. Dorothy would sit on the stool, see the land passing below, and draw everything they agreed was needed for the new map. Magnets with an entwined O and Z held papers in place, and there were secure holders for colored pencils. The wizard had a marvelous telescope to help him plot their path. The Patchwork Girl's bags of wooden nickels were tied to the outside where they might serve as ballast bags in a pinch. Off they sailed on the journey in the mapping balloon on an adventure that would provide many stories of its own. Dorothy's sky view illustrations, coupled with the wizard's careful measurements, made the trip quite a success as a mapping expedition. And Scraps? Why, she'd swing on ropes below the basket, gleefully throwing wooden nickels whenever a group of children spotted them and gave chase. She couldn't have been a more lively and fun companion. They waved at residents of Sky Island as it floated by one day, rested on the top of Mount Munch, and floated through a rainbow where they exchanged delighted greetings with Polychrome and all her sisters. Wherever they went, they were asked to carry home gifts, gratitude, and greetings to Ozma, the beloved ruler who kept her faithful subjects all safe and content. They often stopped for rest and refreshment in curious and quaint towns. In both the humble homes and the fantastic palaces of Ozian rulers, the trio was always welcome and made to feel perfectly at home. For her part, Ozma checked the magic mirror regularly to see how the little party fared. From time to time, she'd have an emissary usually one who was fast and tireless, take a message or parcel of some kind to them just to support their work. It might be as simple as a package of treats from the kitchen or more drawing supplies for Dorothy. Sometimes a complicated matter of governess arose, in which the lovely ruler wanted the wizard's advice. But her various couriers were always happy to assist and would make haste to fulfill these missions. Toward the end of the balloon journey, a conflict arose between a stubborn Winky and Quadling farmers as to which of them had claim to orange peppers ripening between their yellow and red crops. Wanting the wizard's opinion on the matter, Ozma told the glass cat where the balloon was currently headed, just beyond the Tin Woodman's castle, and asked her to go there and return with the wizard's counsel. After all the years you ruled Oz, asked Bungle in surprise, you need help with something like that? It's not that I need his help, Bungle, she replied. I just always want my subject to know that I take their grievances seriously and seek the wisdom of counselors. And with the wizard close to the border where this problem came up, he might help resolve the difference. Despite considering it all rather ridiculous, the glass cat prepared to walk west through the day and night. Bungle was not one to dart along out of sight, hiding in bushes and peering from behind trees. No, this cat marched quickly forward, or she sauntered with a swagger in every step if people were about who could stop and admire her. She endured petting from strangers and rebuffed innocent offers of food and drink. Purposefully crossing the Ozian countryside, she felt quite the queen of all she surveyed. Bungle had left the green spaces surrounding the Emerald City behind and knew by the abundance of yellow fields and flowers that she had reached the land of the Winkies. It would be some time before she'd get deep enough into the country to reach the balloonists, but she kept at brisk pace and did not allow herself many distractions until she saw it. A patchwork cat was perched in the window of a pleasant Winky cottage with the sun warming its patchwork back. Its tail was swinging just enough to make it clear this was no child's toy, but a living creature. To stop and investigate, pondered the glass cat, her haughty sparkling nose in the air, or move on. Mother, look, cried a high voice in excitement. It was Catherine, running through the garden in a direct line toward Bungle. Such a pretty kitty, she cooed, clapping in wonder as the light sparkled off the spun glass fur. Well, an admirer is always worth a stop. Catherine introduced herself and eagerly listened to a brief explanation of the famous cat's mission. Hidda joined them, and soon a curious handful of Winkies had gathered around. Maybe this glass cat can explain how your cat's suddenly running around like no toy I've ever seen, suggested a young boy in the group. Oh, yes, said Catherine to Bungle. My mother made me a kitty out of scraps old patches, and after we got home, Bitsy came to life. Hearing her name, Bitsy joined the party. I honestly have no idea, said Bungle. Only Ozma, the wizard, and Glinda could work magic powerful enough to bring a toy to life. No one else should even be practicing magic. It's not allowed. Hidda, who well understood the laws of the land, had worried about this very thing. When you get to the wizard, she asked, would you be so kind as to tell him about our Bitsy? Perhaps he can look into it and learn what happens. We don't want to go against the law. As Hidda and the glass cat continued their conversation, Catherine grew still and quiet. Her worry was this. If it was wrong for someone to bring Bitsy to life, would the wizard insist on reversing the magic? She glanced anxiously at Bitsy. Others in the small group were looking at her cat too, and some of them seemed to be stepping back fearfully while muttering about illegal magic. As quickly as the thought formed, Catherine resolved to follow Bungle on her journey, to hide if she had to, and hear for herself what the wizard said. That way, she reasoned, even if he said that Bitsy could not continue to be a living cat, she would be the first to know, and she could do something. She didn't know just what, but something would ensure she didn't lose her fabric friend. Unnoticed by all except the sharp-eyed cats, she darted into the house. Quickly, she put on her sturdiest shoes and filled a basket with her mother's fresh bread and half an apple pie. She added carrots fresh from the family garden and a little jar of jam. On the table, she carefully printed a note for her parents. I will be back soon, love, Cat. Then she watched from the window for the conversation to end. As the glass cat set out once again for the west and the little crowd of neighbors dispersed, Catherine quietly slipped out the door and embarked on what was to be her first real adventure. Cats are famously quiet. They are well known to move about, spring up and down, run and climb without making a sound. Well, Bitsy the Patchwork cat was even quieter. She made herself known by speaking up, but otherwise, unless her sequin claws clicked across a hard surface, she didn't make a bit of noise. She only had one habit that was troublesome. She tended to twitch her tail and knock things over, which is exactly what happened next. Bitsy had followed Cat into the house, and watched curiously as she made her hasty preparations and slipped through the door. She then jumped up to the table to see what Cat had left there. Unable to read yet, the paper didn't help her understand what was happening, and when she jumped back down, her tail knocked it right to the floor where it skittled along and became firmly caught under the edge of a woven rug. Clearly, the only way to figure out where her young mistress was going was to follow her and find out. With that thought, she bounded through the door and dashed after the little figure that was fast disappearing down the road. Dorothy and the Wizard were having a leisurely picnic lunch of fruit and cold sandwiches, courtesy of a pleasant shoemaker and his wife, on whose land their balloon had recently descended. Scraps used the time to run around picking flowers and chasing yellow butterflies. Dorothy shared the story of Scraps' recent refurbishment, and the shoemaker, whose name was Bert, offered to help make her a new pair of shoes when the need arose. It was a very relaxing afternoon and an excellent opportunity for the travelers to organize the work they had done thus far while discussing the days ahead. It was here that the glass cat found them. By now, Dorothy was napping in the sun. Stella, the shoemaker's wife, had gone back to the house to straighten up the kitchen. 2 mice and a line of ants were working to carry off the lunch crumbs. The Wizard and Bert loaded the picnic things into the basket between them. They spoke quietly about their shared interests, the pressure of serving the needs of others, and their optimism about the future of Oz. Bert was the first to notice the glass cat carefully picking her way through the field. She was a brilliant sparkle in the bright sunshine. The look of astonishment on his face caused the Wizard to turn. "Bungle," he called in surprise. "You are an unexpected sight. Has Ozma sent you? An emissary, I'm sure," he added to Bert. "Our kind ruler sends those who do not tire with messages when Dorothy and I are away from the Emerald City." The conversation followed as one would expect. Dorothy shook off her sleep to join the discussion. Bert offered in his local perspective on the frustrated farmers. He understood it started when the feuding farmers couldn't agree on painting a fence. The multicolored Scraps found the entire topic astonishing. Then Catherine and Bitsy arrived in the scene. Bitsy had proven to be a good traveling companion for the little girl, who had explained where she was going and why. They had resolved to hear the Wizard's plan for Bitsy and to find a way to stay together no matter what. Unlike Bungle, Catherine did tire and had needed to stop a time or two for rest and refreshment, but she'd wished aloud that she'd get quickly to the Wizard, and somehow that seemed to do the trick. As the pair of travelers seemed to have whooshed their way through the last few miles at before-you-know-it speed. When Catherine saw that the end of her journey was suddenly at hand, she picked up Betsy and moved quietly forward with the cat held in her arms. When they were close enough to hear, she stopped. "Peppers?" They were talking about peppers? And farming? Catherine hesitated. "What is it?" whispered Betsy. "It's not polite to interrupt," Catherine whispered back. Suddenly the name "cat" filled the air, and the pair were all but knocked over by a delighted Patchwork girl who had made a mad dash for her young friend. Conversation stopped as the little party turned in surprise to see Scraps hugging a small child. "Well, well, who have we here?" asked the Wizard. Dorothy thought the girl looked familiar but couldn't place her until she noticed that Catherine held a Patchwork cat. "Why, it's Catherine," she said with a smile, now approaching the child. "Wizard, you remember, her mother was who mended scraps for us so beautifully." Catherine, beaming with pride for the first time. "My mama's sewing is always nice." The glass cat was not interested in Catherine or sewing. Her eye rested on the Patchwork cat, which she was quite sure had just blinked at her. "I see you brought this thing," she said, pulling herself up on her hind legs to get nose to nose with Betsy. One paw rested on Catherine's arm. The other she stretched out toward the cat as her face frosted and her pink brains whirled. "Bungle, be nice," commanded Dorothy. "Catherine's mother made her that toy cat." "This pile of rags is not a toy," Bungle replied scornfully, "and she's not a real cat. She's some kind of illegal creature because she's magically alive." Silence fell over the party as the unexpected announcement. Finally, Catherine spoke up. We've come to ask the Wizard about Bitsy," she said as boldly as she dared. "She was made of Scraps' patches and bits from the sewing box when we were in the palace, but after we came home, suddenly she was alive. I know magic isn't allowed, but I don't know how it happened. I only know I want to keep her." Bungle yawned at this little speech, and Scraps chewed a finger in concentration. Bert looked on with interest. He had been a shoemaker. In the early days before magic work had ended in Oz, he understood that these occasional effects of magic in the lives of ordinary people were matters of concern. His own son had left home when magic was outlawed, insisting his creativity should have no such limits. But it was Dorothy who stepped to the child's side. "I'd do anything to keep my dog Toto safe," she assured her, And as a princess of Oz, I am sure a cat as exceptional as Bitsy, a cat that's from our own dear Scraps, can have a home with you. The wizard, having rightfully guessed that his own charm was responsible, lifted Bitsy from Catherine's arms and looked straight into her shoe-button eyes. Do you remember being alive before? He asked seriously. No, came the reply. Do you know why you came to life? No. Do you have the ability to work magic yourself? He said, continuing to pursue a line of questioning that might reveal a transformed witch or wizard in their midst. Me? Said Bitsy. I don't even know what magic is. Satisfied and smiling, the wizard proposed to the group that his enchantment of Scraps had somehow animated Bitsy. And that, my dear, he said to Catherine, means I am responsible for this bit of magic, which makes it perfectly legal. Although you, Bungle, need to tell them back at the palace to get any leftover patch pieces safely tucked away before anything else is made of them. Bitsy leaped back into Catherine's arms and nuzzled her chin. Scraps turned a cartwheel, and Dorothy clapped with pleasure. Once again, Bert's eye was drawn to the road. This time it was Hida, rushing toward the group. Her face spotted Catherine, and relief spread across her face. Catherine ran to her mother excitedly, explaining that Bitsy was the wizard's own magic, and Princess Dorothy herself had promised she could keep her. Catching her breath and grasping the situation, Hida explained that she'd discovered Catherine missing and had been searching all day, following directions from those along the way who'd seen the little girl walking alone and accepting rides from all headed down that road. But Catherine, how did you ever get here so quickly? Asked her mother. Her puzzled face made it clear she had no answer to that question. We just walked and wished we were here until we were. I think I may know, said Bert quietly. Hida looked at him for the first time, then looked more closely. I know you, she said. Years and years ago, you helped me with something. I remember coming to your home. Your shoes, said Bert. You were always running around and ruining shoes. Never saw such a woman for wearing out shoes. It was the time when charms were still allowed, so I finally made you an enchanted pair of shoes that let you wish yourself from place to place. That time had been long, long ago, and it took Hida considerable time to remember back that far. I do remember a day when I could zip back and forth around Oz on all kinds of adventures. But then I settled down, started a family, and was content to stay home. The adventures ended, but I'd forgotten the shoes. I stopped making them when magic was outlawed, Bert said, that anything might have become of the shoes I'd made. Catherine here mentioned that you'd pulled from your sewing box to make Bitsy. If anything from my traveling shoes had found its way into that box, like her shoe button eyes? Asked Dorothy, who'd been following the conversation with great interest. The wizard, who was just as fascinated, understood. Some notion or another from those shoes must be part of Bitsy, which would mean she could travel on a wish, and that carried them along the road so quickly. Then perhaps, suggested Bungle, loudly clearing her throat, since the wizard and Dorothy have agreed this cat can stay as she is, the three of you can just be wished away home. That would let the rest of us get back to important matters. Like mapping? Asked the wizard, amused that the selfish glass cat would have her ego so clearly bruised by the addition of Bitsy to Oz. Or peppers, added Bert, fighting an amused smile of his own. There's still the matter of the orange peppers. Scraps gave Bitsy a squeeze and Catherine a hug. Travel safely, little friends. We will meet again and share adventures. Then she added in a whisper, but not until I find those other scraps and sew up a bit more mischief. That's the end of my story. There's lots of, what do you call, Easter eggs in here that if any of you catch them or figure them out, post in the comments, because it'd be fun for me to see if anybody catches on to some of the crazy things I was doing in this story. Also Hida, I should say, that name, I'm going to say in Arabic. I did a whole lot of Google translating to find a good name. It means shoes. I was going to name her Tilda, but then Gabriel Gale named his character Tilda in Ages of Oz, and Matilda Joslyn Gage, sorry, didn't get to honor her. I went with shoes. That's a clue. Anyway, thank y'all so much. I hope you enjoyed the story.